So, with that, let us begin, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salatu wassalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in amma ba'd. Last week we went through, we focused a lot on Islamic scholarship. I want to go back a few slides and mention something that I forgot to mention last time. This is a picture I showed us last time. That is the relationships between these various scholars. So the names in bold are the imams of fiqh, and the names in blue, which you can't really see it here, but you can see on the bottom, they're a little bit different color. These are the imams of hadith, right? What I wanted to appreciate here is how interconnected Muslims are, how interconnected they were. And you have this picture that shows us, right? So for example, where's my pointer? Right, so for example, Imam Ahmad, he's over here in Baghdad, is the teacher of Bukhari from Uzbekistan. And Bukhari is the teacher of Muslim, right? You find that they're all connected to one another, even though the land mass is quite massive. So it was quite normal back then for someone from Uzbekistan to be residing in a place like Egypt, for example, or Mecca or Damascus. Like today, in our times, it's quite normal for a family from New York to move to California, or from California to move to Montana, there's this interconnectivity that I just wanted to appreciate, and this lasts throughout Muslim history. You'll even see this once we get to the Ottomans and the distribution of land back then, and how Muslims were still interconnected even at that time. Another thing about the four imams that I wanted to quickly look over is the following: the epistemology. So when you look at the Hanafis, Malikis, Shafi'is, and Hanbalis, someone who's not very experienced in their opinions and how they work, they start looking at this, okay, why are they all different? Why is there so much difference when they go back to Quran and Hadith? Why is that? Well, each one of them had a epistemology. An epistemology is what we call a methodology. How do I come to a conclusion on a particular issue or fiqh ruling? Right? We go through these stages. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now you find that there's difference between them. So the Hanafis and the Malikis, their epistemology is a little bit longer than the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis. And what that means is the Hanafis and Malikis are not more capable, they're more determined to come to a clear-cut conclusion. Whereas the Hanbalis, for example, they have a very short one, and this goes back to the philosophy of Imam Ahmad when it comes to fiqh. Imam Ahmad says, fiqh isn't meant to be clear-cut, meaning it is not my goal to come up with one opinion on an issue. Why? Because if Allah wanted to make something clear, He would have. So the fact that something has an amount of ambiguity tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to differ a little bit, and therefore I'm going to allow that to happen. Okay? Now, this isn't to say one is better than the other. Rather, what I have is a hypothesis that each of these madhahibs play a particular role in greater society. Again, I say this is a hypothesis because it needs testing, but it is something on my mind. And that is, each madhab comes with a particular angle or a particular way of presenting Islam that is more effective in one realm of society than another. So the Hanafis are very, we have one opinion, that's it. That's one. This is it. To the extent that they have what's called al-fatwa alayh, or al-mufta bihi. The Hanafis have one opinion. This is the opinion of the Hanafis. In this time, we only give this opinion. Malikis, they'll have maybe one or two opinions, but they're a little bit looser. The Malikis are more concerned or put a lot more emphasis in what's called maqasid, the reasoning. What is the Sharia trying to get at? When it allowed this particular action, what is its goal? Why did the Sharia allow it? What's the vision behind it? Maqasid. Where is this taking us? Where is the Sharia trying to get us? The Hanbalis, they're looser. In the particular issue, in the Ahmad's school, you find that sometimes there are 5 opinions. In some issues, 10. Right? There's this looseness. Shafi'is, they go very deep into branching off of issues. You get into, if you want to research an issue that is very, very rare, for example, start with the Shafi'is. Because they do this. They keep going and going and pushing the research to where it reaches, the furthest extent that it can, right? Now, how does this work in greater society? Well, when it comes to law, for example, the Hanafis work best. Not saying that the other schools are incompatible. The Hanafis work best. Why? Because law needs to be clear. This is the law. One opinion, that's it. Anything else is wrong, right? That's how law works. So Hanafis, you find that their school is most adopted by governments today. The Muslim governments, most of them follow Hanafi school. Why? Because they have this thing. The Malikis, they work to show us what's meant by this. The Hanbalis are very effective when it comes to society. When you're working with people who come from different backgrounds, whose situations are different, well, you can't have this clear-cut, this is it and that's it. So you have to follow this and you can't do anything else. The Hanabilas have a lot of leeway, a lot of flexibility. You have 5 opinions here, choose what's best for you. There you go, right? And even the Hanbalis say that whatever opinion you find in the school, then you're allowed to give fatwa with it, right? Where the Shafi'is fit, I still haven't come up with that. Where I got this from is the following. When you look at the 50s, 60s, 70s, the most prominent scholars of Islam were Hanafis. And this was a time where, post-colonialism, they're still kind of picking up the pieces. Now the Hanafis need to play a role in getting government together. Well, now we're on our own. Previously, it was the Ottoman empires. After the Ottomans, you had the colonialists. They were holding things together. They were the ones governing everything. And then now we're on our own. Hanafis came and they kind of started establishing law. After that, the 90s, the early 2000s, it was the Hanbalis. Ibn Baz, Ibn Uthaymeen, these were the prominent scholars. Al-Albani, although he wasn't a Hanbali per se, but he had much of that Hanbali, approach to Islam. Why? Because during this time there was what's called a sahwa, an awakening, an Islamic awakening. People are becoming more religious. Google this, Egypt, 1960. Egypt, 1960. And you'd be shocked. I mean, it's literally people running around in bathing suits. Egypt, Muslim country. Now it's completely different, right? So perhaps the Hanabila played that role. Now, who are the prominent scholars? Malikis. Bin Bayya, Sheikh Muhammad Wild al-Dadaw, Sa'id al-Kamali, yes, from Morocco. These guys are now the prominent voices. They're the most seen. Perhaps it's because now, as we are further establishing ourselves, what you find is that we need to understand what is the vision of the Sharia. The Malikis do just that. Again, this is a hypothesis, right? I'm not saying this is it, this is the wisdom behind it, but this is just a thought in my mind that I thought I'd present. Another question is commonly asked, why follow a madhab when we are commanded to follow Quran and the Prophet ﷺ? A very, very, that's a good question, right? The reason is the following. When we approach Quran and Sunnah, we need to approach it in a disciplined manner, meaning it's not random. We're not randomly coming up with conclusions based on our own opinions. That's not the way it works. It needs to be disciplined. In order for something to be a science, it needs to be disciplined. And that's what the madhabs did, right? That's what they did. So, for us after that, or in order for them to do that, in order for someone to do that, what has to happen is that the person doing it needs to have a very large wealth of Islamic knowledge in order to truly give ijtihad, or critical thinking, its due right. Now, if I, myself, have 100 hadith memorized, but there's 1,000 or 5,000 hadith out there, well, how am I going to come to a correct conclusion when I'm leaving out so much of the Sharia? You see what I mean? So the madhabs, what they work for us is that they give us a shortcut. These guys, these 4 imams, did that for us. So when I say, what is the ruling on this? I am going to these various madhabs who did that ijtihad for me, and I'm just taking a shortcut. Now, this doesn't mean the doors of ijtihad are closed. It could be, theoretically speaking, someone can come who has the ability to embody all of the Sharia texts and have the mind to be able to come to their own conclusions. That's very much possible. But for those who can't, the madhabs work as a shortcut for us. Okay. Here is a distribution of the madhahib. This blue over here on the left in northern Africa, that's Malikis. So the Malikis are blue. The Hanafis are green, the eastern part of the Muslim world. The Shafi'is are this yellowish color down here. Over here, the eastern part of Africa and the Asians, Indonesia, Malaysia. The Hanbalis are this brown color over here in present-day Saudi Arabia, parts of Oman, and the Emirates. And then this over here, this yellowish color, that's Shi'ism, the Ja'fari Shiites, etc. The red is also another one of Shia, etc. So you can see it's about 40-some% Maliki, 40-some% Hanafi, and the rest is between the Maliki, the Hanafi, the Hanbalis, and the Shafi'is. Okay, we talked about that. Now I want to give a moment to the following, and that is to look at some of these terms that I've been blurting out left and right, and I've been taking it for granted. Maybe not everyone knows of these words, so I'm going to take a moment to kind of elaborate. First is Sunni, right? We call ourselves Sunni, or maybe most people here call themselves Sunni. What does that mean? We spoke about that last week a little bit, and how Abu Hanifa was the first person to coin this term, Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, in a letter he sent to a fellow scholar. Now, Abu Hanifa is taking that from a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, "Alaykum bi sunnati wa sunnat al-khulafa al-rashidin." I mentioned this hadith before, that follow my sunnah, my way, and the way or the sunnah of the four or the khulafa al-rashidin, the rightly guided khulafa. Also, you have another hadith or a variation of it in which the Prophet ﷺ says his people, or those who are on my sunnah, they are the saved group, etc. This is Sunni. So when we use this word as a theological doctrine, what exactly does it mean? It's what you all know. The 5 pillars of Islam, the 6 pillars of Iman, this is Sunnism. An added element to that is the reverence of the companions, and you have other certain theological issues which they will present just because it was questioned or it was challenged during a particular time. So for example, part of Sunni doctrine is the Quran is uncreated, right? Is that coming directly from the Quran, like the pillars of Islam, the pillars of Iman? No, but because it created an issue, the Sunnis or these orthodox scholars said that this is our position and this is the orthodox position. Okay, likewise. When it comes to Shi'ism, we'll discuss them in a moment. All right, once we talk about the Fatimids, the Khawarij, we heard this name a lot and we continue to hear this name today. The Khawarij comes from the word kharaja, and that means to leave. And they're called Khawarij because they left the body of Muslims. And this is what they always do. They always isolate themselves from society, right? Till this day, they act the same exact way. So Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they're always in the very rural ends of the Muslim world. They're isolated from society because they view society, all of us are kuffar, right? We have betrayed Islam and we are all hypocrites, so they isolate themselves. They are very violent and they're very extreme and fundamental. They do have some doctrine. So one of the doctrine of the Khawarij is that someone who does a major sin has expelled themselves from the religion. So a major sin is an act of kufr. It's an act of blasphemy, unless they repent from it. And they try and argue that through verses of the Quran. The Mu'tazilites, we spoke about them a little bit, they are a rational group, right? They are the ones who promoted this concept of the Quran is created. They have other doctrine, for example, al-manzila bayn al-manzilatayn, a place between two places. They say that those who commit a major sin, they're not believers, but they're not disbelievers as well. They're between the two. What the heck that means? Again, you can scratch your head. To them, and they're intelligent people, they had their reasons for saying that. We strongly disagree with that. The Quran makes it clear. It's paradise or hellfire. It's belief or disbelief, right? The philosophers, Ahl al-Kalam, like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, one of the two Ibn Rushds, who else? Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, these guys, Ibn Arabi, these are philosophers, Ahl al-Falasifa, which Imam Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah really push back against. They come with a lot of strange, unorthodox, quite often blasphemous doctrine, but they are very intelligent. Now their problem was, or at least our problem with them, is that they took Hellenic thought They took the epistemology of Greek philosophy and started using that tool, that epistemology, to understand Quran and Sunnah. Right? So to them, someone like Ibn Sina said that the prophets, this whole thing of heaven and hell, these are all stories that the prophets used to get society in line. There's no such thing as heaven and hell. Right? Now to us, that's blasphemous. Right? But that's the philosophers, and they do play a role. Maybe we'll talk about them if we talk about Ghazali and maybe Ibn Taymiyyah. Okay, any questions on these guys? Yes?
What about, especially in the last 10 years, there's people that have come up that I never heard of in my life. Yazidis.
Right.
Druze. Alawis.
Right.
All of these.
Right.
So, do they fit in this group or what?
Right. So once I talk about Shi'ism, I'll mention a few of those names. Yazidis, I don't think they're ascribed to or they go back to Shi'ism. They're just a paganistic religion. They've always been living in Muslim lands. Just keep that in mind. So when ISIS went and persecuted them, the question is, well, they've always been there. Why didn't the companions do that? Why didn't any of these scholars talk about them or go after them? They've always lived amongst the Muslims, right? So yes, when it comes to Alawis and Druze, I'll talk about them in once I get to the Fatimids.
Qurani and the Quranic people now, we have in Jordan, they are getting more, especially they are PhD professors. They believe in Quran, Sunnah, you tell them about Hadith, Qadr, anything that they
Sure. So these Quraniyun, this group who are exclusively Quran oriented. In other words, they exclude hadith. They say hadith is a fabrication. It's unreliable. Okay. There have always been people like that. In fact, there is a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, don't let a time come when people will say, I only want to hear what's from the Quran. Hasbi ma fil Quran, right? I only want what's in the Quran and I won't take anything else. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet says, Allah has given me something like the Quran, right? That is hadith. And the Quran says itself, وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ. So one opinion among scholars of the Mufassirun is that this verse is saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down something to the Prophet ﷺ to explain the Quran. So hadith, one of its functions is that it clarifies certain ambiguities from the Quran. Okay? So, there's a lot we could talk about here, but what I'll say is the following. The whole attack against hadith started as an Oriental movement, Orientalists. The recent one, modern times today. It started as a Orientalist movement to try and discredit hadith, okay? And this has spread through parts of the Muslim world. And you can see it's catching on. What's funny and ironic and sad at the same time is that Orientalists, so Muslims from our side have argued against that and pushed back. Today, very recently, Orientalists are starting to conclude more and more that hadith is valid. It's valid. Why? Because the whole argument against hadith is the following. You have to have faith that this is what the Prophet ﷺ said. Right? You cannot come up with an epistemology that will accurately determine whether the Prophet ﷺ said this or not. So they're using this, you have to believe that the Prophet ﷺ said it. You can't really prove it. Okay? What's interesting is that now the counter argument to that, which is really suppressing the Orientalist agenda, is the following. And that is, in order to believe that hadith, what we have as hadith, is all a fabrication, you have to have faith. How so? To say that hadith is fabricated and that the Muslims were recklessly and irresponsibly transmitting this hadith, you have to do the following. You have to believe that Muslims all across the world, despite their differences in culture and way of thinking, their schools of thought and all of this, despite all of that, they constantly and consistently and effectively kept agreeing upon certain things. You see where I'm getting at? You have to have faith that was going on. That Muslims, despite their differences, when you look at when we spoke about the Hanafis and the Malikis, they were ideologically, they were at odds. They didn't like each other's approaches. They criticized one another, they critiqued one another, right? Are you saying that in fiqh they're very they're against one another, they're critical of one another, but in hadith they're agreeing to lie upon the Prophet ﷺ, it doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent. So in order to say that hadith is all a fabrication, you have to have faith that what you're saying is correct. So you find that in the West, or at least in the Orientalist realm, this is dying out. This idea, this notion that hadith is fabricated is dying out. But Muslims, because we're always lagging behind these days, it's just reaching us, and they think they're smart, right? Oh, I've come with something new. Can I answer your question? Okay. So these are regions, geographical regions. You have the Levant, or Syria, what's called Sham in Arabic. You have Egypt, which is Misr, the Arabic West, al-Maghrib al-Arabi, and I'll show these to you in your map. Iraq, Persia, which is Faris, Khurasan, Anatolia, the Byzantine Empire, Rome, Abyssinia, and the Arabian Gulf, al-Kharij al-Arabi. So you have this. Okay, let's start from the west and go on east. This area up here, the very north part, up until Egypt, right? This area is al-Maghrib al-Arabi, the Arabic West, right? What we call today North Africa. Egypt was like this, a little bit further south than present-day Egypt. Okay? Khalij al-Arabi, the Arab Peninsula, which we still call today Gulf of Arabia, right here. Asham, the Levant, is the following. Some opinions, and this is the opinion of Umar radiallahu an, the Levant starts its southernmost border is what's called today Taymat, which is about halfway between Amman, Jordan, and Medina. So right about here. This area, including Iraq, the southern part of Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, that is Asham. That is the Levant. Okay? Anatolia is present-day Turkey. The Byzantine Empire was the eastern part of Europe, this area right here. The Roman Empire was Western Europe, France, Spain, England, etc. That's the Roman Empire. Central Asia, what's called the origins of the Turks, which we'll talk about probably next week, in this area over here, central. Faris, Persia, was parts of Iraq and present-day Iran. Right? Khurasan is, the heart of it is Afghanistan, parts of Iran, parts of the Turkic areas, and parts of Pakistan. Okay, what else do we have? Did I forget anything? Khurasan, Anatolia, Byzantine. Abyssinia is present-day Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya. That's Abyssinia. That's where the Najashi was. And that's where the Muslims made their first immigration, over here. What else do we have? Okay, so last week we stopped at this point, at this slide, khuruj. This concept of drawing arms against the ruler. Now this is becoming a very debated issue in the Muslim world because of the Arab Spring and what's going on these past recent years, okay? And you have certain opinions, especially those who live in the Gulf, who say that khuruj is forbidden. Drawing arms or revolting against the leader is 100% forbidden. It's part of our aqidah, right? And you have people on the other end who say it's part of aqidah as well. It's part of our creed and theology that the ruler has a place, okay? So this draws a lot of confusion amongst the believers, amongst Muslim discourse, etc. So let's take a very short detour and tangent and let's look at this a little bit. The majority of scholars prohibited taking arms against the ruler unless they are clearly outside the fold of Islam. This comes from a hadith, إِلَّا أَن تَرَى مِنْهُمْ كُفْرًا بَوَاحٍ. Right? The Prophet ﷺ says, obey your rulers unless you see clear disbelief in them. So some scholars went to the extent by claiming that there's a consensus among scholars, right? That it's a unanimous opinion, like Imam al-Nawawi and others. The reasoning behind it, the illah, why do they forbid this, is because it almost always leads to an extremely negative consequence, meaning bloodshed. Look at history, Islamic history, right? Anytime a revolt occurs, the results have always been negative, okay? Now, I pose two questions here. What if the ruler is not fulfilling their end of the bargain? The second question, what if studies indicate better circumstances after a revolt? So when we say, historically speaking, the results have always been negative, does that mean in the future it'll always be negative? Not necessarily. So is it theoretically possible that there is a time when if a revolt were to occur, it will bring about a positive consequence or a positive result? Now when you look at Europe, when in present day Europe, not ancient days, present day Europe, when they do a revolt against the leader, it actually ends up turning positive for them. For example, in Ukraine, there was several years ago, they took one of the ministers, the prime minister, and they put him in a dumpster, right? It's pretty funny. It turned out well. In the Muslim world, or at least in the Arab world, it turned crazy, right? So what's the reality? Let's entertain these two questions. To better understand this, we need to ask the following question. What is the relationship between the society and the leader? Okay, what is the relationship there? So one must understand the legal aspects of the hakim. What is this engagement? Now, from a fiqh perspective, the relationship is contract-based, meaning there is a contract between society and the hakim, the leader. What's the evidence for that is the hadith of, or the saying of Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, when he was appointed as the Khalifa, he said, "Aqiluni." He said, "Let me go of this. Let me leave." Right? That shows what? That there's an agreement, there's an engagement here. Likewise, when you look at the books of fiqh, the Khalifa or the Sultan or the Amir, he plays a certain role. They have a responsibility that they need to fulfill. Right? So when do we say a particular ruler is zalim, is unjust? Well, if they're not fulfilling their role, their responsibilities. Okay? So what is the contract between society and the ruler? It's wakala, aqd wakala, agency. Meaning, you are an agent. We have assigned you as an agent of ours to take care of certain realms of our reality. Does that make sense so far? Meaning, you have been appointed by society to take up certain responsibilities. That is what's called in fiqh wakala, agency. An agency, according to fiqh, is a contract that can be dissolved by either party. Meaning, if society no longer wants their leader, they have the right to dissolve that contract. Likewise, if the leader no longer wants to be in that position, they have the right to step down. And the evidence for that is the hadith, what I just mentioned about Abu Bakr. He said, "Aqiluni," let me go. Which shows us that it's okay for him to leave. Likewise, it's okay for society to ask him to leave. And from this, we take also, if either party does not fulfill their terms, the law allows a certain course of action. So if society does not fulfill their role towards, their responsibility towards the leader, well, we have the penal system. The government can enact certain laws to penalize these individuals. Does that make sense? Why are there laws? Right? Our responsibility is that we obey laws, so long as it's in accordance to Sharia or it's just, right? It's reasonable. Now, what happens when they don't fulfill their part, which is pretty much the majority of the Arabic world, right? Are they allowed to take arms and go and do a revolt? Perhaps, right? So khuruj thus is allowed or prohibited based on the expected outcome. It's based on the expected outcome. Meaning when the scholar said, do not do khuruj against your leaders, it's not because in of itself it's forbidden, but rather it normally leads to a negative consequence. Right? And this helps us reconcile between the fiqh opinion, the popular fiqh opinion, and the actions of Abu Hanifa and Malik and Shafi'i and others who revolted. They weren't silent in face of the khulafa, as I mentioned before. And they either ideologically fueled or they encouraged revolts against the Umayyads, against the Abbasid, right? But mostly against the Umayyads. Well, did they not know of these hadith and these rulings? Of course they knew. But they understood it in a deeper sense than what we do. Okay, so has it been clarified? And the final point is that khuruj is when people take arms against their leaders. Protesting is not a form of khuruj. So those who go out and start saying, these people who are protesting are doing khuruj, that's simply not accurate. That's not accurate. It's not khuruj. That is people asking for their rights. Okay? This is a very brief presentation on khuruj. Is that clear? Are there any questions on this?
Can you give a real example for khuruj? Like, because most of the things were mostly like people protesting or just a revolution, but there wasn't like killing or something, or like from the people's side to the person in authority.
So what happened in the Arab Spring, in Syria, Egypt, other places, right? It did not start as khuruj. It started as protesting, and then these countries transgressed their sanctity, started killing them, right? And that's when things got out of hand. So that's Syria, for example. They were protesting for their basic rights. And Syria, the government, is one of the worst governments you'll ever find in history. Literally, there are stories of people going for example, from Jordan. They would go to Syria, Damascus, for business. Prices are cheaper over there, right? So they'd go and the products are better. They'd go, get some things and come back. Some guy would go, he just wants some shaving machine, right? A trimmer, and he's gone for 20 years. Where is he? We don't know. Where is he? We don't know. They have these secret prisons. They change people's names so that you can't find them. This is the Syrian regime, right? So when the Syrians protested, they were just protesting. We want our rights. We want things to change. They're the ones who transgressed against society, and they took up arms. Now it's self-defense now. It's not khuruj, it's self-defense. Same thing with Egypt. I mean, Egypt didn't technically take up arms. Once the army started attacking them, started running over them, okay, well, we have to defend ourselves, right? Like that. So khuruj hasn't really occurred. I can't think of a good example in our times today. Most of it, if not all of it, started as protesting, which, got really bad, right? And it led to fighting. Does that answer your question?
Just last question. So that's mainly from the people's side, but like when the authority side or like the ruler side, then it's not considered like khuruj, right?
I don't understand. Can the ruler do khuruj on his society?
You were saying, for example, like in like tawheed or wakala, it's like, for example, can be dissolved by either party. So if we build the concept of khuruj based on this concept too, is the concept of khuruj mainly from the population against the authority, but it doesn't apply vice versa, right?
Yeah, so when it comes to khuruj, it's, as far as I'm aware, it's specifically the society going against the ruler, right? Okay. All right. So with that, now we enter another era, a new era, and that is the low Abbasids. So the previous 300 years, right, or not the 300, the previous part of the Abbasid era was the high Abbasid era. When culture was high, science was high, knowledge was high. Now we're getting into a very, very dark part of our history. And that is the Abbasid fragmentation and the Shiite, what's called the Shiite century. Okay? Now, if you want to break down Islamic history into eras, the first 3 centuries are called the formative period, and they start with the Prophet ﷺ and end with the Buyids, which I'll talk about, taking over Baghdad. And in Arabic, they call this a Salaf al-Salih. Have you heard of this term, a Salaf al-Salih? A Salafiyya, you've heard of Salafiyya before, right? Taking it from this, the Salaf al-Salih, which is the first 3 centuries. And these are a praiseworthy century because of the people during that time, the success that they found, and because of Prophet ﷺ, when he said that the best generation is my generation, ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُم, right? 1, 2, 3. So the scholars consider that 100, 200, 300 years. Okay? And precisely at 300, things start going bad, right? At 300, a group called the Qaramita enter Mecca from what's present-day eastern Saudi Arabia, Ihsa and these places where there's still Shiite populations in Saudi Arabia. They entered Mecca, took the black stone, started killing all the pilgrims, right? And they took the black stone for a good 20, 30 years. What's interesting in the books of fiqh, the early books of fiqh, for example, like Al-Khiraqi from the Hanabila, he says that when he's talking about Hajj, part of the sunnahs is to kiss the stone or touch it, right? He says, and in it he says, if it's there, right? If it's there. So what do you mean if it's there? During his time, it was taken. So he said, if it's there, then do this. So that's a Salaf al-Salih. The 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries are the early Middle or Classical period. This is when the Khilafah starts breaking down into sultanates. You start hearing Sultan, 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 right? And it ends with the invasion of the Mongols. And then you have the 7th, 8th, and 9th, the late Middle and Classical period. This starts with the time of the Mamluks and the Mongols, and it ends with the Ottoman takeover of Syria and Egypt. And then you have the 10th, 11th, and 12th century, which is early modern. This is when the Renaissance are really at full speed. This is when Europe starts to build itself up. The European economy passes Muslims' economy in the mid-19th century, 18-something, okay? Imperial ends with European colonial expansions, etc. And then after that, you have the colonial era or the modern era. All right, so the Abbasid fragmentation. The empire breaks down. The caliphs are unable to control their militias and their finances. Weakness at the center leads to provinces breaking off. 2 kinds of successor states: administratively independent provinces and ideological challengers. Okay, I'll explain what that means. So when it breaks down, you have now large provinces of the Muslim world. Some are ideologically driven, like the Fatimids, and others are just administratively independent, like the Buyids, and I'll talk about these. So this is called the Shiite century, the onset of the, okay, we said that. Okay, so this is not as clear as in the PowerPoint, as always. So you have Egypt here. You have this area. You can see this shade of pink, right? And then you have this area here. This is another section. You have this area here. That's 3. And then 4. So the Abbasid Caliphate breaks down into 4. On the west, you have the Fatimids. And I'll talk about each one of these. Here you have the Buyids. All right, here you have the Ghassanids. And here you have the Qarkhanids, right, who will become the Seljuks. Right. So what are the consequences of this breakdown? When you look at Islamic history, it's quite amazing. It's important to understand this point. If one area of the Muslim world is doing poorly, know that another area is doing well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always take care of this ummah because it is His religion and it is His people, it is His Quran and it is His messenger. Right? So if we're doing poorly in one area, you'll find that there's always another aspect of our ummah that's flourishing. Subhanallah. So at this point, the revenues are no longer flowing to Baghdad. So Baghdad was the center of the Muslim world. All wealth was going to it, which made it really the city. And its other cities might be powerful and important, but they weren't getting as much attention. With the flow of revenue slowing down to Baghdad, right, what happens is there's an economic florence in the former provinces that, right, I can't really say this, okay. Right, so what happens is now since all of the economy isn't centered on Baghdad, it's being distributed across the Muslim world. And what you have here is now that these cities have more money, they are building themselves up. So back then it was really Baghdad, it was just the superpower. It was the hub, right? Everything else was secondary. Now you have Damascus is growing, you have Egypt will start growing, Cairo will start growing, and other areas. And what happens is now the focus becomes centered on a particular city, the people of that city start developing it, and you'll see how that progresses with time. Culturally, this is very interesting. Culturally, the successor courts patronize their own forms of culture and merge aspects of the Abbasid Islamic culture with local cultural traditions, among which is Persian in Arabic script. So this is when the Persian language starts transforming to the Arabic script. So I know Urdu, they use Arabic letters. I think the Pashto and these other languages, they're using Arabic language. Well, that occurs in this time. They're taking their language and now they're using Arabic letters to become more culturally involved in the Muslim world. The consequences, Islam and Islamic culture become much more accessible to local people, as they were no longer identified mainly with Baghdad and a few local elites. This is the period where there are mass conversions to Islam. So if you remember that chart that I showed you, right, when you saw it at the center where it kind of really picks up, when people are entering Islam, this is this time. And one of the reasons is Islam, the image of Islam starts changing to something that is a social religion, a religion meant for society, and not a political ideology. So I'll give you an example to try and draw this point a little bit closer to our minds. How many people here identify as Democratic or Republican? No one. Why not? Okay, let me ask this question. How many people are here involved in politics? Like actual politics?
Election?
Not voting. They're involved in politics. City, state, whatever level. Is anyone here involved in politics? You see what's going on? I'm not Democrat. I'm not a Republican. Why? Because I don't care about politics. These are political ideologies. So when Islam entered these worlds and they became the religion or the ideology of the rulers and a small sector of society, well, other parts of society, these other religions, other people, weren't really involved in that. So Islam was kind of like this elitist or this elite religion or the religion for the politicians and some elites from society. Now that the caliphate, the Khilafah is breaking apart, and the scholars have presented what Islam is, what the role of Islam is, right? We are people of the people, if you remember that. Imam Ahmad was a man of the people. That's where his mission was. People start realizing, well, Islam isn't an elite religion or religion for the elite, it's a religion for all. So add to that now culturally, these other parts of the Muslim world were becoming incorporated in Muslim culture. And not just you have your Persian culture and we have our Muslim culture and we're two separate things. With Persian being now in the Arabic script, well, now Persian culture is finding its way into Muslim culture. Does that make sense? This is when people start entering Islam in very massive amounts of numbers, right? How interesting. When politically we're strong, some people entered Islam. Well, when we're politically weak, a lot of people entered Islam. And this seems to be something consistent. When the Mongols come in, as I'll mention, when the Mongols invaded the Muslim world and the Muslim world was politically just dead, right? That is when Islam reaches central parts of Africa and the Asians. That's when. When the Muslim world were, from the inside, weren't doing so well, da'wah was very strong. Like what? Like today. The Muslim world politically is very unstable, but the da'wah is strong, very strong. SubhanAllah, right? Okay. Other socioeconomic consequences, authority now becomes a triangle. So if you remember, I showed the circle, the two circles. You have the Khalifa and then you have the ulama. Now it's a triangle where you have the Khalifa, you have the sultans, and you have the ulama. Now, as I'll mention this in a moment. Society learns to live without active participatory governments. As people live, you governments aren't doing well, our lives are stable, we're okay. We're okay that we don't need you guys, we'll deal with ourselves between ourselves. And this continues for a very long time. And they actually perfect this and they master it. Intellectual sophistication and consolidation. As I mentioned, now that the flow of wealth is being more evenly distributed across the Muslim world, you find that Islamic institutions start to develop. And very much so during the time of the Seljuks, and I'll mention that. So legal and theological madhabs are born now. So when Imam Ahmad, Abu Hanifa, Malik, and Shafi'i, during their time, there was no Maliki school. There was no Hanafi school. These were intellectuals who did not have a standardized curriculum, right? When you go to, for example, all the scholars in Syria are following one curriculum. That wasn't the case. We're like that today. Even schools and universities are like that. There's a curriculum. Before that, scholars were these independent think tanks. I'm not following a particular curriculum. Rather, I am free to critically engage these texts as a whole. I don't have to follow a particular thing. And once we get to Ibn Taymiyyah, I'll show how that plays in. So the madhahib are starting to be developed during this time. There are some factional violence between these schools. So the Hanafis and the Shafis, one example in Nishapur, right? They literally, it said that they went to the streets and started fighting each other, and that really harmed the city, right? Theological conflicts, the Hanbalis versus the Ash'aris in Baghdad, the Ash'aris versus the Kalamis in Khurasan. So you do have these internal struggles as well that sometimes got a little bit out of hand. Also, you have the rise of spiritualist groups, what we call today tasawwuf. I want to take a moment to talk about this because it's quite interesting, and Sufis are all over the place. They're all over. You have these extremely crazy Sufis, and you have Sufis that present a lot of good and a lot of richness to the Muslim tradition and our Quran and Hadith. So tasawwuf, the word tasawwuf comes from the root suf, which means wool. Right? So during this time, remember, it's a wealthy time. Although politics are not so stable, it's a wealthy time. And with wealth, it becomes apparent on the people's lifestyle. Muslims back then used to wear cotton, clothes made of cotton, like we do today. Right? So tasawwuf looks at this and says, no, this is too worldly. Things are becoming too worldly. Everything's about progressing in the world, being rich, being well established in this world, etc. Like what we face today. What we're going to do is we're going to start having a counterculture to address the spiritual needs of the individual. So suf, when no one wears wool. It's itchy, it's not comfortable, you can't wash it. Cloth you can wash, or cotton you can wash, but you can't really wash wool. So this was kind of a sign of this asceticism, zuhud, as we say in Arabic, right? This is a counterculture. Now, where is this coming from? This is what we want to understand. Where is this developing from? There are, I guess, three things that Sufism is either established because of, or a result of, or a counterculture to. Number one, this is in any particular order. One reason was because of what I just said, the worldliness. You have the khulafa, the administration of the Muslim world, the government is pushing towards worldliness, or at least they claim that, pushing towards developing our cities, developing our lifestyle, making it comfortable, etc. Right? And this creates a type of spiritual deficiency. Anyone living in America feels this. We all feel this. There is a spiritual deficiency. Right? I'm not being transformed by what I do. Why is that? I need to understand my inner self, what we call today psychology, right? I need to understand my inner self in order to properly properly be transformed, effective, engage Quran and Hadith, or even the spiritual elements of the faith like prayer, salah, zakah, etc. How can I do that? Another reason was the rationalism versus the rationalist movement. So we mentioned that the Mu'tazilites during this time, reason was the language of intellectuals. But reason focuses on the dry parts of knowledge. This is why this is it. This is the case. This is our opinion. This is the evidence for it. It doesn't focus on the inner parts. It focuses on how our mind can be used to understand certain issues of Islam. Right? It doesn't focus on that. And when a person becomes too involved in that and they neglect the heart, well, it becomes a little bit problematic spiritually. Right? A third reason was because of the khulafa. So I mentioned worldliness, the intellectual, I think because of the khulafa and the political instability. Right? So part of the cultural movement was that now Islam was being seen as a social entity, not a political one. Right? So how do we deal with that culture and whatnot? Sufism comes and tries to be part of that, or to address it, or to present a certain element of it. Okay. Also, something else that happens that was just on my mind during this time, when you have a lot of people converting, you have people from India, Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism. Right. These people are entering Islam. Christians, Jews, they're entering Islam. And they're bringing a little bit of baggage with them. In Hinduism, we used to do this. Well, let's do it in Islam as well. Right? In Buddhism, we used to do this. Well, let's do it in Islam as well. right? So you have this, and they bring in what we call innovations today. And they kind of found Sufism as a place where it can find a role there, the spiritual side, and they come with very interesting slogans that nothing is real but God, right? So this is something that's debated, is talked about. Sufism incorporates it, etc., and whatnot. So in the beginning, Sufism was a movement that was really followed by the elites. It wasn't followed by the average population, right, or the commoners. It was followed by the elites. And Sufis, get this, Sufis were Hanbalis. Hanbalis were the Sufis. The people of Hadith were the Sufis. Why is this interesting? Because today, it's the exact opposite. It's always seen as the Hanbalis are anti-Sufis. They're the arch enemies of Sufis. Ibn Taymiyyah is the arch enemy of Sufism. Rather, during this time, the tension was between Sufis and the people of Kalam, the Ash'aris. Today, if someone's an Ash'ari, they're most likely going to be a Sufi as well. See how things have changed, subhanAllah? But how it started, how it changed. So the Hanbalis saw Sufism as a way of understanding Hadith and Quran in a different realm. Right? Later on, these are reconciled, they understand it a little bit more, and they start using Sufism as a science to discipline this particular realm of Islam, the spiritual realm. So Sufism starts turning into a science rather than just some thoughts people say. Okay? And Sufism spreads a lot. The father of Sufism, or one of the masters of Sufism, is Al-Junayd. Al-Junayd is a scholar of Islam, someone who knows the Sharia, and he is the one who really, or one of the ones who started a Sharia compliant, if you will, so Sharia compliant Sufism. Right? And that's why you have in Sufism, you have this massive ideological spectrum. There are some Sufis they present so much good to the Muslim world, right? And they present a Sufism that addresses the needs of the heart, the spiritual needs, that without going outside the realm of Sharia. Example of that, Imam al-Nawawi, Imam al-Ghazali, Junayd, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn al-Qayyim. Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim, if you look at their works and how they address spirituality, you'd say they're Sufis. But they're seen as enemies of Sufism. Now, I'm teaching to the women a book of Ibn al-Qayyim called Madarij al-Salikin. The levels of the station, the levels of seekers, those who are seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Each one of us, we are walking this path called the Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path, but the level at which we are engaging the straight path is different. Right? There are different levels to engage it as well. Ibn al-Qayyim talks about it, and he has a very massive book, and it's a very beautiful book. But Ibn al-Qayyim is seen as like an arch enemy of Sufism, and that's not really the case. He is against Sufism that's not disciplined by the Sharia, or Sufism that goes against the Sharia, right? And he is explaining a book written by Abu Ismail al-Harawi, who is a Sufi master and a Hanbali. He was a Hanbali scholar. And this is very interesting. And when I started learning about this, I was like, wow. SubhanAllah, how we don't know our history. But Sufism is good when it is disciplined and in line with Sharia. Once it goes outside of that, it becomes very problematic, to the extent where people started promoting pantheism. Pantheism is when a person believes that God is literally infused in everything. God is present, physically present everywhere. They'll say God is in this, right? God is in that, God is there, that's very problematic. And other Sufis where the sheikh becomes like the pretty much a god. They become a god. What the sheikh said, that's it. Right? That is very problematic. Alright, so now we move on to the Fatimids. Now, I'm going to be jumping from geographical area to geographical area. The Fatimids are from the mid-10th century to the 12th century of the Common Era. I'll talk about them, and then I'll go into another region, the Buyids. And I'll start back from the 10th century and go like that, okay? So it's not too confusing. I'm going to focus on each dynasty or era. So the Fatimids. The Fatimids are a Shiite group. A Shiite group that's called the Ismailis. The story goes is that an individual from Syria whose name is Ubaydullah, another name for the Fatimid dynasty is the Ubaydiyah, right? The Ubaydi dynasty. And he is part of the Ismaili tradition. If I could find it somewhere. I don't know, it's somewhere over here. And basically the Ismailis believe that God is present in the political leader, right? So this is a very extreme, even for Shiites, it's a very extreme type of Shiism, right? To us Muslims, to us Sunnis, they're clearly outside the fold of Islam. Anyone who believes that God is inside or present in the ruler, or the ruler is God, I mean, that's clearly against Islam. But before going into all of that, when we look at Shiism, you have these various sects, right? You have the Twelvers and the Ja'faris. Where are they? They are the present-day Shiites in Iran and in southern Lebanon. You have other forms, the Zaydis. The Zaydis are probably the closest Shiite sect to Sunnis. Okay, and they are the present-day Houthis in Yemen. So the whole feud, Yemen, the guy who tried to politically take over Yemen, and Saad the Gulf entered and stopped, and etc. And now it's a big mess, right? They go back to these Zaydis. And if you remember, a few talks ago, I mentioned them. They go back to Zayd al-Abidin, who's the son of Hussein, who's the grandson of Hussein, I believe, because he's Zayd bin Ali bin Hussein, right? He's a Zaydi, and then these other groups of Shiite, they rejected him. Rafadnak, they told him. Why? Because when they asked him, what do you think about Abu Bakr and Umar? He said, radiyallahu anhuma. They said, Rafadnak. So he is from the progeny of Ali radiyallahu anhu and Fatima, and he should have a higher status, but because he rejected the notion that Abu Bakr and Umar radiyallahu anhuma are any less than great companions, they rejected him, and that's when you have the split between what we, the Sunnis, call Shia and Rafidah. Rafidah we consider, or Sunnis consider, to be a more extreme Shia ideology that excommunicate the companions or speak ill of them, etc. So among the Shiite groups are those that are clearly outside the fold of Islam, like the Nusayris and the Druze, right? The Nusayris and the Druze, who are in present-day Syria. So the Nusayris are the Alawis. They're considered to be kind of synonymous. Who are Bashar al-Assad and his family. They come from that, and they also believe that the ruler is God, right? And that's why during the whole civil war, what they would do is they take these people and they would force them to prostrate to a picture of Bashar al-Assad and kiss it and whatnot. Well, that's coming from their ideology. They're clearly outside the fold of Islam. Yes. So what is the fundamental differences between Sunnis and Shiite? There are two that I can think of, and that is, number one, the imamates. So if you look at all the sects of Shiism, they have something to do with the concept of imams. Okay, so these are, this middle column are the imams, or those who are from the progeny of Ali and Fatima radiallahu anhuma, right? And they are considered to be of high stature. Some Shiites consider them to be imams in that they have authority, religious authority, to abrogate certain rulings, and they are the ones who make the final decision when it comes to religious law. Others consider them better than prophets. Now, other Shiites will reject that, but they consider them better than prophets. And even amongst this, they differ. So you have these seveners. We believe in these 7 imams, and that's it, ending with Ismail, right? And that's where the Ismailis come from. You have 12ers. There are 12 that end with the Mahdi al-Muntadhar, right? This little boy who went into a sirdab, a cave, and he's been there ever since, right? From like 1200 years ago, and they're waiting for him to come out, and he is the Mahdi, etc. Yes. I will point out that Sunnis, a lot of these imams, Ja'far al-Sadiq, Muhammad al-Baqir, Zayd al-Abidin, we consider them to be righteous people and scholars as well. Some of them, we don't consider them to be so righteous. Some of them, we don't even consider exist, right? Historically speaking. Yes. So that's one. And then the opinion of Sahaba. I mentioned this in the very beginning, the very first lecture. Our belief in the Sahaba is that radiyallahu anhum, Allah is pleased with them, and so are we. Right? We have no right to speak of them in anything less than reverence and respect. Okay, so that's another major difference. Now, why don't Sunnis accept this concept of imamate? Because it's not in the Quran. Right? It's just not there. This is fundamental to Shi'ism. This is fundamental to like we say, Salah is fundamental to a person's faith. Belief in the next life is fundamental to a person's faith. The Shiites consider the imamates to be fundamental to the religion. We just simply cannot agree with that because it's not in the Quran. Okay, I'll give you time for Q&A. So who are the Fatimids? They come from southwest Iraq, and again, an individual named Ubaidullah from Syria who claimed descent from Fatima and Ali. In 909 proclaimed himself as the Mahdi. He went to the northern part of Africa, the Maghreb al-Arabi, starts doing his promotion and propaganda, gathers a group of North African nomads. Right? If you want to do a revolt, always start from the countryside. Because it's people who, they're sick of life, they're bored, right? They don't have much intelligence. You tell them, I'll give you this and that, and they're pleased with that. And what's interesting, when you look at, for example, the mukhabarat in the Arab world, the intelligence agencies in the Arabic world, they always have their eye on the rural areas more so than the urban areas. Why? Because this is where the revolts start. So his efforts start in northern Africa, what's present-day Tunis, and he is able to take advantage of the dissolving Abbasid Caliphate, the fragmentation, and take over up to Egypt, as I will show you right here. This was the Fatimid Caliphate. Right? Took Mecca and Medina in this area. Okay? So this is when I said that they took the black stone, I believe, during this time. And originally his base was in Tunis, so in this area over here, but Tunis was nothing. It was not a city, no one cared about it, so he went to Egypt and established what's called Al-Qahira, Cairo. There the Fatimids established that, or I should say they didn't establish it. Amr ibn al-As is the one who established Al-Qahira. It was called Al-Fustat, which means tents. That's what it calls, but it was never developed by the Muslim world or by the previous Khulafa. They come and they start developing Al-Qahira. In fact, they are the ones who establish Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar was established by the Fatimid Caliphate. And they last for about a century and a half. Yes. So institutionally, the institution of the Fatimid Caliphate had ideological claims, infallibility and impeccability. Right? They believed that the ruler was divine. In fact, the last of the rulers, I think Abdul Hakim, where is he? It's in the next slide, I guess. I'll say it then. So they developed Al-Azhar, I said that, bureaucracy, organization of the revenue system. They had a military power. They had a very strong navy. They had slave soldiers from the Nubians, the Turks, etc. And what's interesting, this plays a major role in the upcoming centuries. In addition to the Berbers were the natives of northern Africa today, Barbar. Right? So they had a government going. They had relationships with the Byzantine empires, but they would also raid certain areas of Italy and other areas. They had trade routes to Europe, etc. So the Fatimids, their primary concern was economical, more so than ideological. They were ideologically driven, but they never really forced that on the citizens, right? Yes. So the Ismaili propaganda began, especially in Syria and Persia, the mountain regions. The empire's greatest extent, Arabia, including Yemen, etc. We saw that. Cairo replaced Basra and other Persian Gulf ports as the main, one of the main ports or business hubs, trade hubs in the Indian Ocean. So the decline of the caliphate begins with Al-Hakim, one of the leaders who proclaimed himself as an incarnation of the divine, outlawed the manufacture of women's shoes. He outlawed the manufacture of women's shoes, right? And forbade working in the daytime. He was called the Mad Caliph. He was insane. And he said that he went into the mountains and they never found his body. Right? He was insane.
There's a slide about assassins.
Right, over here. Supporters of movements of Ismaili thought throughout Sunni. So yeah, so they had they would send people to Sunni lands to do da'wah. Right? But where would they do this? They couldn't do it in the cities where scholars were. They'd have to go in the outskirts and in regions that aren't really, that you don't have a presence of knowledge. And what's interesting, we hear of these things happening today. So for example, when I was in Jordan, they caught a group of people who were pretending to be from Jama'at Tabligh. You know, the Jama'at Tabligh who sit in the masajid for 3 days or for a week or whatever, and then they go to another masjid. They were pretending to be part of that, but they found out that they were sent by Iran and they're Shiites preaching Shiism. So they would start in these outskirts in these regions. Why? Because there's not nearly much knowledge, or the imams aren't as qualified to address and catch these issues. The so-called assassins, I don't know what Professor Uwaymir was meant by this, so I'm not going to comment on that, including the so-called assassins. I don't know what he meant by this.
Yeah, I can.
Yes.
They were actually called Hashashin.
Hashashin.
From hashish, they were used to
Right.
take the drug and then it became a...
The buzzed individual.
An assassin today means a person who kills somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
So back then it meant...
What they did, they would drug themselves to go do whatever they had to do. They were like covert operatives sent by...
who would they assassinate?
Whoever the king or whoever they were,
okay.
Loyal to,
Mhm.
would send them out on these missions to carry out their it was like a suicide mission.
Interesting. I don't know that. Okay, so now we come to the Buyids, but I'm going to stop here because there's not much time. We'll leave a little bit of time for Q&A. As I mentioned, I invite each and every one of you this Friday, after tomorrow, to join the presentation about Muslim inventions. I hope you come, bring your family. This is a project that we're hoping as a community we can work on, build. Inshallah, it'll become something worthwhile. Also, with the time changing next week, this class will be on Wednesday after Isha prayer. Isha prayer will be at 7 o'clock. Inshallah, after that, we will come and we'll stay probably until around 8:15, inshallah. So not too much different than what we've been accustomed to these past few weeks. Okay, any questions? Yes. 7 p.m. Yes.
So time changes tomorrow?
Sunday.
Sunday, oh yeah.
Yes, Sunday. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question, like the wars, any sort of wars or political conflicts that go on in this period, like how many, like what would be like the casualty, like statistics in like this particular war or something?
Right. Not as much as we would imagine. It wasn't really, these political entities would take over one another. Society wasn't really involved in it. So what would happen is you'd have an entity come from another area, overpower a weakened and collapsing government, and just take over that government, and society goes on. Right? It's said that the Muslims perfected this routine from how accustomed they became to it, to where they had they had protocol for this. They had protocol where when a new regime would come in, they had everything ready. This is what we do. This is what we've been doing. These are the districts, and they wouldn't change anything. So these other entities that are coming in, they're not really changing much. They're just new faces in office. That's literally what it was. So it doesn't seem like there was any casualties. If there were casualties, it's just one army against another. Society wasn't really affected and impacted by this. And as you saw, the Fatimids, they didn't really interfere with society. They didn't have a forced conversion mission, nor did the Buyids, who are also a Shia ideological base.
What about like the Sahaba's wars with like the Byzantines and the Persians? Like I was reading on Wikipedia like some like high casualties, but I wasn't like sure really if those statistics are, I don't know.
I can't comment on the exact numbers, but sure. So the Battle of Yarmouk, there were high numbers on both sides. Yes. Yes.
You mentioned about the Sufis, and they were thinking that God is physically existent. What they were thinking about prophets?
Oh, so yeah. So some Sufis go to the extent of saying that certain saints, certain individuals are better than prophets. That certain awliya, you've heard this word, right? A wali is better than a prophet. So that's also a deviation, if not blasphemous.
But what they were thinking about prophets?
It depends on where you are in the ideological spectrum. Right? If a person thinks a wali is more important than and better than a prophet, right? That's blasphemous, because there are no one better than prophets. The evidence is the Quran, right? But someone who thinks a wali is important and they have certain abilities, for example, some can go to the extent saying that this wali can answer our dua, or we go to them for intercession and whatnot. That can also be an act of blasphemy. So there's a massive ideological spectrum here. Right? But the best is the one who takes the good and leaves the bad. Yeah, Jibreel.
I have a question. I heard someone say last night in a lecture that in the Hanafi madhab that if a Sahih hadith that's not mutawatir, if it contradicts the Quran, then the verse from the Quran or the Quran, then the Quran takes precedence because it's mutawatir. Have you ever heard anything like that?
Well, that's obvious. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. Right? And no one's going to disagree with that. But what we're going to say is that you will never find an authentic hadith that clearly contradicts the Quran. The Prophet ﷺ will not contradict the Quran, because both are inspiration. Does that make sense? So those who try and say that if a hadith goes, I won't take hadith unless it's in line with the Quran. Well, if there are clear contradictions, well, I'm going to question the authenticity of the hadith in the first place. Right? If not, there are not going to be any clear contradictions. Allah Ta'ala. So let's stop there. جزاكم الله خير وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.